Hi, everybody. Eve Harrow, Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network, broadcasting from Israel. Yes, I'm back. I had a very interesting trip to the States. Spoke at a church near Tampa, Florida, of an organization of people, a community who are interested in their Hebrew roots. Then I went down to an Orthodox synagogue in Boynton Beach, a JNF luncheon in Boca Raton, and then in Phoenix, I spoke at the Makor Synagogue on Shabbat, at the East Valley JCC Sunday afternoon, and Sunday evening was about 200 people I spoke to at the Passages series for the adult education at the JCC. So it was really an incredible trip, going back in just a few days for APAC and a Shabbat in Toronto at the Bayit Shul. But there was no way that I wasn't going to be home for Purim and this marvelous week that we have in Israel. It is just before Shabbat. It's Friday, March 15th, just a few days before Purim. And I'm sitting with Rabbi Anthony Manning, who I've known for a long time. Our sons are friends. We've each fed the other one's son for many years, who has, like so many of us, started off life not necessarily anticipating or planning where we would be sitting a few decades down the road. So first of all, Rabbi Manning, thank you so much for joining me on such a busy day.
Really my pleasure. It's lovely to speak to you.
I had to pull you out of the kitchen to do this, but I appreciate it very much. So let's start maybe with what's going on now. You are an educator, among other things, and that's something of a theme that people who listen to the show know, because I'm fascinated specifically by Jewish education and where we're going with that and what we need to go with that. And you are a teacher of girls?
Yes. I teach young women, either post-high school, who are here for gap year programs, usually English-speaking. Some of them coming from Spanish-speaking countries, but they're usually from America, Australia, England, South Africa, etc. And the main focus of my educational work is with that crowd, with the post-high school crowd. They're here, as I said, for a year in Israel before they go to college. Some of them stay in Israel, but most of them do go back to where they came from. And this year is really transformational in many ways, that it sets them up for life in terms of their Jewish focus, Jewish learning, and we can talk a bit more about that if you want. But I also teach another crowd of young Jewish women who are post-college. These are young women in their early 20s who usually did not grow up in observant homes and therefore did not take that gap year in Israel when they finished high school, but now after university feel they need to play catch up a little bit, and they come to Israel to learn, usually not for a whole year because they're in the middle of qualifying, getting work, etc. But they come for whatever. They can come for a few months, maybe even a year. So I'm involved in those two different groups of women's education.
So how did you get involved in education? What is your background?
Okay, so I suppose to some degree I've always been a teacher, but I was in a different field originally. I originally was a lawyer. I grew up in the north of England. I'm from a town called Leeds, which is a large industrial town in the north of England, about 200 miles north of London. I went to Oxford University and studied there law. In England, you study law, or you can study law as an undergraduate degree. They call it their jurisprudence because it's Oxford. They've got to call it something fancy. And I studied law undergraduate. I met my wife there. She's actually from London. She was also studying law. And after Oxford, we went to London, and I qualified as a lawyer. And I worked for many years as a corporate real estate lawyer. I was building shopping malls, not particularly interesting, but nevertheless useful for people who want to go shopping. And for many years I did that. We lived in North London, but then about 17, 18 years ago, or early 2000s, we both felt that we needed a major shift in the way that we lived our lives and where we lived and what we did, etc. And we ended up coming to Israel.
Did anything precipitate that? Because that's a pretty big move to not only shift the type of life that you're leading, but then leave what was, I would imagine, a fairly comfortable life in a Western country and move to the very not boring Middle East.
That's for sure. It's not boring. And when we came, it was especially not boring. We were in the middle of the Intifada, in 2001, 2002, and things were really quite dramatic here. Yeah, there were a few things precipitated it. As well as being a lawyer, I had taken a number of higher Jewish qualifications. I went to yeshiva in London, in various different places, and in Israel, and I was already giving classes in Jewish thought and Torah learning when I was a lawyer. And as I began to give more of those classes, I began to realize that I actually enjoyed doing that much more than I enjoyed being a lawyer. I was, thank God, very successful as a lawyer, and I became a partner in the firm that I was in the city of London, a kind of Wall Street type practice. I was in my late 20s, I was a partner there, but I was beginning to realize quite seriously that I very much was, I felt that I was meant to be a teacher and educator rather than just be someone building shopping malls. So that was one realization. A second realization is that my wife was very much involved as the Intifada broke out, and there needed to be a lot of Jewish sort of publicity or hasbara and try and explain positions that Israel was facing. My wife was very much involved with this. She runs a marketing agency. She was very successful in PR and marketing, and she was becoming increasingly frustrated in England that story that they were putting out to the news outlets and media in England was just not really being received with any kind of interest. And she felt a growing need, almost ironically, as things were getting more difficult in terms of the security situation in Israel, she felt a growing need to be in Israel as well. And I definitely was part of that. Both of us come from strong Zionist backgrounds. We both grew up in Zionist youth groups and Zionist focus. And we both felt the need to be in Israel. And the precipitation, if you like, what precipitated the final decision, it was not an easy decision. As you quite rightly said, we were living a comfortable life, and in London, and although it's not quite, Southern California, but nevertheless, London is London, and coming to Israel, we gave ourselves until the Jewish New Year in 2001 to make a final decision, because we were going back and forth, and there were many family members who were not so pro the idea, and it was 9/11 actually that precipitated the final decision, because I was a lawyer in London. That came just about a week or two before the Jewish New Year that year. And one of the things we were dealing with is the perception that London was a safe place, and New York and America were a safe place, and Israel was a dangerous place. And that was part of our decision-making process. But then when 9/11 happened, I don't know if people realize, but when New York, went haywire and the planes flew into to the Twin Towers, all around the world, people assumed that the same thing could be happening there. Because they just didn't know. When the impossible happens, then anything can happen. So they evacuated the city of London. I remember at the time we were told to go home immediately. There were people running through the streets, fairly panicky, not quite knowing where they were going or why they were, leaving. But I came home that evening and I said, well, that's as far as I'm concerned anyway, that's our decision made. And my wife totally agreed. And then we made a decision and we came about 8-9 months later.
Well, when was it 7/7? Because London had its own attack that kind of got, interestingly enough, very much taken out of the news very, very quickly.
Right. We were already in Israel when 7/7 happened. But you're right, it didn't have the same impact on the British psyche as 9/11 had on America. It was a different scale as well. But also the British react differently to these things. They tend to have a kind of stiff upper lip, or they used to anyway, approach to these things. We were already in Israel when that happened. But for us, that urge, to be in Israel, and we have family here as well. My wife has a sister here, and that was a draw as well for us to come. But also for me to shift into education. There's an expression Rabbi Beryl Wine uses. He also used to be a lawyer and became a very eminent Rosh Hashiva. He talks about leaving the prophets of the law for the law of the prophets. That's a nice line that I use sometimes, and it really is. It's an incredibly meaningful profession to be in, teaching, especially young people, but it's not quite as profitable financially as the law used to be.
I mean, you make an interesting point, which is when things are going haywire here, people come. The flights to Israel are packed when something is going on here. People just, or as I said to somebody when I was in Florida last week, and someone said to me, it was actually an Uber driver that I had, Jewish guy, never been to Israel. I said, why haven't you come to Israel? He said, it's too dangerous. I said, just a few months ago, you had a situation here where someone walked into a high school and killed a bunch of kids, and the security guard ran away. All right, in Israel, if anything's going on, people run towards and people try and help. So you're afraid to come to Israel, but here you have a situation where not only things are happening, but nobody knows how to take care of it. So to make a long story short, he has written to me since then, and we're working on getting him here. So hopefully that will happen. So you're into education. Why specifically, though, young women?
Well, a few reasons. First of all, my wife is very keen for women's education to be promoted as a very strong agenda, and I certainly picked up that from her as we've been married. She herself is very knowledgeable, and she is, very keen that women should catch up, if you like, in learning Torah. I think there is a lot of catch up that needs to be done in terms of women's learning. Classically, until around 100 years ago, women's education across the board, secular and religious, was pretty much ignored and underplayed. Many women were not literate. Certainly women did not have access to higher education. And as that changed in the world at large, there was a realization that had to change too in the Jewish world, specifically around 100 years ago when Sarah Schneer in Poland was dealing with the reality that the young women there in the 1920s were highly educated in their secular studies, but pitifully uneducated in their Jewish studies, and therefore they said, look, if in microbiology you treat me like a 22-year-old, but in my Jewish studies you treat me like a 5-year-old, then I'm not interested. So she realized, and others at the same time realized as well, that had to change in a radical way, that women's education had to be really brought up to the same level, at least as a secular education. But that's still a slow catch-up process, and women still feel that they're lagging way behind men in many ways in terms of the education they get at school, Jewish Torah education. And I think that it's incredibly important to certainly to give women the realization that they can learn, that they should learn Torah, and that they are obligated in many ways to learn Torah on a very high level. Now, without getting into the technicalities, men have a somewhat different obligation in Jewish law to learn Torah, but women still have a significant obligation in Jewish law to learn Torah, and that is not being realized in many cases. So that's a strong feeling that I think women should and can really excel in this area. Also in the Jewish world at the moment and the general world, where women's involvement generally in society has been much broadened and deepened over the decades, in the Jewish world and in the world of Orthodoxy, where women's roles in society is a complex issue, one of the areas in which they can and do and should excel is in learning and teaching on the highest possible level. And therefore, if in many ways this is for many people the undiscovered country that they can really go to. So I think this is an area where there is a strong green light for women to be really growing in that. So that's one reason. Another reason is if you're going to teach 18-year-olds, I think just on a personal level, the maturity level of teaching 18-year-old women is far in excess of the maturity level of teaching 18-year-old men. I don't really want to teach high school. High school teaching is an amazing thing. It's a certain kind of skill, just like elementary school is a skill. But if I don't want to be a high school teacher, I want to teach adults, then at 18, I really need to teach women. At 22, I'm happy to teach men, but assuming that men are mature by 22 or if ever. But at 18, I really would prefer to teach women. And there are other factors as well. More practically speaking, there are many, many institutions teaching women's Torah on a very high level post-high school, at least 35 or 40 in the Jerusalem and broader area alone. Therefore, there are a lot of opportunities to teach. There are a lot of areas of Jewish law and thought that you can teach. In yeshivas with boys, they tend to spend a lot of time learning Talmud, which is incredibly important, but it does mean that there are less teachers needed and less opportunities to teach a broader range and curriculum of Jewish studies. So, women definitely give that opportunity.
Okay, so I want to parse out, because my listeners, a lot of them know we talk broadly about teaching Torah, but there are a lot of different elements within there. First of all, there's teaching Tanakh. There's teaching the portion of the week. They're teaching, the biblical canon, if you were. Then there's the whole overlay of what we can call the oral law, right? The Talmud and the Gemara, which for a long time was seen as really more the purview of men. So it was okay to teach the girls, let's say the book of Esther, we're in the week of Purim, but not necessarily the Talmud and Gemara. Is that you're teaching them that to the girls as well?
So that's a great question, and I think there are important opportunities that women have to learn across a broad range of Jewish topics. I am the director of a school called Midreshet Tehillah. Midreshet Tehillah is actually in Haranov, in Yerushalayim. Our main focus is teaching Jewish thought, actually. We teach what's called machshava, Jewish philosophy, Jewish thought, really trying to address the big questions that people have if they don't deal with them in some significant way when they're 18, 19, when will they? Questions like, how do we understand our relationship with God and God's role in the world, and the difference between different kinds of people, and many, many questions that really are the center of Jewish thought. The learning of Talmud is part of that. There are different ways you can learn Talmud. You can learn either Talmud as a dedicated study, learning page after page after Talmud, or you can bring Talmudic sources in different ways to try and explain and underpin the other areas that you're doing. Now, we teach Tanakh in great depth, and we teach, as I say, Jewish thought. Talmud is not something we're focused on in great depth, but there are many other institutions that do that and do that well, and that's very important. In other places that I've taught in the past, I used to teach in a place called MMY, which is very well known as well. I was very keen to teach the girls Talmud there as well, Gemara in their studies. But every place, it's very important that there are different schools that focus on different areas. Some schools are incredibly Tanakh, Bible focused. Some schools are very Jewish philosophy and thought focused, and some schools are very much Gemara focused and oral law Talmud focused. And we're in that second category. We really want to try and get the girls to think, to be more thought through, deeper versions of who they already are. And if you like, my speciality in that sense is I teach Jewish thought, specifically focusing on Maimonides and others around that period. But I also teach quite a lot of depth, the developments of Jewish law and the oral law process, as you mentioned, to try and understand how did Jewish law get from a revelation at Sinai to where we hold today, and all the different, the millions of pages of Jewish text today. How did you get from A to B? And understanding that process is critical for a sense of confidence in and commitment to the halachic Jewish law process.
So I happen to know the school MMY because a couple of months ago I took them on a field trip. We went up to Har Bracha. We did Tanakh in the site where it happened, where Joshua gives the blessings, where the Levites, after we come with Joshua on the hills of blessing, and Har Gerizim and Har Ival. And it was like going with the Tanakh as a picture book and seeing these places in Shiloh where the Mishkan was. So they were amazing girls, and they really just wanted to soak it all in. So I had a thought a few weeks ago that I'm still working on, that I actually wanted to run by you, because people have women, because you have, on the one hand, you're teaching women on a very high level Jewish philosophy, on even possibly a higher level than some of the men are going to be getting, because whatever they can absorb, they can absorb. But you hear from the feminists, the modern feminism, about how Judaism is not good to women, and how it's women are second class, and some of the things that you're doing maybe are just to humor the women. But when it really comes to the major roles that women have to play, let's say the rabbinate, then women are going to be told no. And I had this very strange thought. It's never occurred to me before, a few weeks ago, because one of the complaints is that in the Tanakh, for example, in the Bible, women are mentioned much less than men by name, maybe 1/10. And suddenly I thought, maybe because we didn't need to be. In other words, that the Tanakh to some degree was written for men, because there is an instinct, there is, at least I feel as a woman, that I think women get about our relationship with God, which is what's supposed to be the whole point of learning Torah, is to get closer to Hashem, not just as a means to an end in itself. And I think that many, many women know that instinctively. Perhaps we didn't need so much the formal education, because, first of all, we're part of creation, because when we have children, that's as close as you're going to get to doing something that Hashem did. So what are your thoughts on, I just raised a few subjects over here on all of this, as a man who is teaching women on a very high level?
So I think that there's definitely a different approach that many men have, as to many women have, in terms of their connection to Judaism, connection to Torah. Having never been a woman, but having seen many women. That's
a relief, because these days one never knows.
Right. But it's important. So I can't speak as a man necessarily for how all women feel, but I don't think I can speak for how all men feel, because I really feel it's difficult to draw very broad generalizations. I think you can be fairly general, but yes, I agree with you to some degree. I think many women want to connect with Judaism in a somewhat different way than men. But I'm nervous of essentialist definitions of what men are and what women are, especially because a lot of what we are is nurture rather, not just nature. And the way that men and women are educated in today's world is very, in a way, they're very similar to each other, and therefore the gap, if you like, between men's connections and women's connections has significantly narrowed. In that many women think like people used to assume men think in such a way. Many women think that way, and many men feel and think emotionally and intellectually in a way which is more like traditionally people have felt that women think. And I'm not sure what I think of all of that, but it's a reality, and therefore I feel that there is now a need, if you like, for a broadening of the curriculum, that men and women have access to ways of connecting with Torah, which maybe traditionally have been for one or the other. By the way, I'm not sure I totally agree with your analysis about the Bible.
I'm not so sure I do either. It's just something I've been going around in my head.
Right. I feel that the Tanakh, certainly the Chumash, has a very clear theme going through it, that men and women are partnering in a way in which they are sometimes working together, and sometimes the women are trying to clean up the mess and work out the problems. I'm thinking of Abraham and Sarah, and thinking of Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah and Rachel, etc. The women in those narratives take just as strong a role in many ways in actually pushing the main good, strong agenda forward. If you think of Miriam and her role in getting Moses into the whole mainframe, and as that goes through later on, if you think of Devorah and Yael and other people like that, I think it's important not to be teaching apologetics to try and, I do not like the way of thinking that to try to make women out to be superior to men in order to just brush over the difficult areas in which would rather not discuss, of the areas which women do not have the halachic ability to do some of the same things that men do. So I'm not in favor of that rather overemphasis on women's quote-unquote superiority. I don't think that's necessary, and I don't think people really appreciate it. But I don't think we need to go there, because actually when we look at the system of mitzvot begadol, when we look at the 613 mitzvot and see how many of them are gender-specific, I think sometimes people are surprised by how gender-blind most of the fundamental areas of Judaism and Orthodox Judaism and halachic Judaism are as well. We have an over-focus on synagogue, which is, synagogue is very important and central to Jewish worship, but I think we've picked up a lot from the non-Jewish world in terms of the church focus, which is also critical. The Jewish focus is not as synagogue-focused as it is maybe home-focused and other things as well, and community-focused and learning-focused. And these are areas in which I think women are very involved and can be brought more involved. And therefore, I think that there's a lot of very positive things you can do without treading on the thin ice of halachic areas, Jewish law areas, where women will be have less access to certain parts of Judaism and or certain parts of the synagogue service.
So I mean, that's something that's been bothering me for a while. I do think that especially Ashkenazi Jewry, meaning the Jewry that lived in Europe for so many years, has been affected by Christianity and negatively affected by Christianity. I absolutely see, when you look at the difference between, let's say, some of the commentators from the Sephardi world, from the Middle Eastern world, versus the Ashkenazi world, you definitely see, and I think the differences, and I think some of those differences, and it makes complete sense, are related to the fact that they were living in a very Christian world, Rashi, etc. So where would you feel, though, in terms of, is there a limit on where you would see Jewish women's roles in Judaism? For example, one of the issues that comes up, of course, is the rabbinate. Right now in the Reform movement, in the conservative movement, movements which incidentally don't really apply so much here in Israel than they do out in the West. Where would you see, is there a limit on women's roles within the Jewish framework, let's say hierarchical, for lack of a better word, in the structure of, let's say, the synagogue or in schools? Any problem with a woman being a principal of a school or versus a rabbi of a synagogue?
Yes, there are most definitely limits. There are limits in many areas of halacha to what men can do in different parts of life, what women can do. Halacha is about enfranchising and enriching people, but there are also limitations that have to be brought in order to focus on different areas of growth. So yes, there definitely are limits. Those limits are set by halakha, which is Jewish law, but that's the easy statement. The difficult statement is defining exactly what those limits are, and in that area there are different approaches. Certainly, this is not something that one can work through in a soundbite kind of environment. I would encourage people to go to my website actually on that, which is www.rabbimanning.com. Where there are around 400 audio shiurim, audio lessons and lectures together with source sheets. And one of the issues that I deal with very directly there is exactly what you're asking. Women's access to learning, the issue of Jewish women rabbis, etc. So yes, there definitely are limits, and women rabbis is not something in the Orthodox world which I expect that we'll be seeing in the near future. Whether that will change at some time in the more distant future is a good question, and I address that in my lecture, and there are different approaches by different people on that, but no question that I think that halachically that we have to understand that there are limitations, and those limitations are set by the senior decisors, as we call poskim of the generation. Our job as the, if you like, as the people, is to make our feelings well known to our leaders, our halachic leaders and our Jewish leaders, and help them to understand the way that society is moving and thinking, so that they can make the right decisions based on Jewish law. And I think we have to be clear that they're the ones that have to make those decisions. We can't have a sort of a free-for-all where everybody is deciding for themselves. If you just look at the beginning of the book of Judges, each person doing what's right in their own eyes is a recipe for anarchy and total disaster. On the other hand, you can't have a totally frozen system where nothing can ever develop and move. That's also bad and unhelpful. Somewhere in between those, there has to be a development and an evolution in a way which is carefully thought through. As Jews, we're not in a rush to change things quickly, and history has taught us and experience has taught us that usually when we do that, it's something of a disaster. But there are many people thinking about this, and that's, like I said before, one of the areas in which Jewish Orthodox women really can grow without limitations in many ways is in Jewish learning, Jewish teaching, and that is in many ways, I think, far more important for the community than focusing overly on the issue of the rabbinate, which is, at the end of the day, like I said, for us, I think a lot less important than people might think. And, once you raise the question, if you mention the word feminist, you have to define what that means and who people are. And there is not just one feminist agenda. There are multiple, and they don't agree with each other. Why should they? We don't agree with each other as well. But I think definitions are important. Sound bites are unhelpful. But if people want to study this, then there is ample material on that.
So you would be all right with women teaching men?
That is a separate area again. That comes into the issue of what we define as tzniut, of the Jewish role of women in public, and whether there's a certain kind of, the English word modesty doesn't really do it. It's not the right word, but certainly interaction between men and women is not a free-for-all as well in Jewish law. Neither should it be. There can be sexual agendas between men and women. It would be ridiculous to say that there can't be. And trying to guide that fine line between what is and what isn't appropriate is also important. There are different people who have different views on this. I personally feel that in today's society, where women are highly prominent as chief executives, as people who run communities and businesses and governments and countries, it doesn't make much sense to say that women should not be able to teach Torah within a framework where they're teaching men. And I certainly would be supportive of that on a personal level. I can understand where there are certain women that feel uncomfortable with that, and certainly people shouldn't be encouraged to do things that they personally don't feel comfortable with. But again, there are a multitude of different approaches on this, because there are different societies. We're not just a entirely homogeneous one-track society. I remember I was once at the Western Wall on Friday night with a group of Jewish students who were new to Orthodoxy and observance, and after having Friday night at the Kotel, which was an amazing experience, where there must have been 2,000 people there, and there were around 200 separate little services going on all at the same time. And they said to me, that was amazing, but wouldn't it have been better if we could have had one service with 2,000 people all praying together? And I said, no, actually, I don't think it would have been better. The way that we do things is that we work together and we tolerate each other and we work with each other, but we have our own streams, we have our own approaches, and within boundaries. Obviously, not every approach is right just because you think it's right, but within boundaries, I think that there is a lot of room for different interpretations and different approaches with, and this is one area as well. So you'll get different answers from different people.
Well, so since you mentioned the Kotel, so that's one of the issues, of course, that makes the headlines all the time, even though I think it's really just a very few women making a lot of noise about the Kotel being an area where women can have their own services and not necessarily being run as an Orthodox synagogue where men and women would pray separately. So what would you answer to that?
Again, small numbers of people making large amounts of noise and seeking sound bites is never a way to deal with any serious issue. So I would say to stop looking at the headlines and start learning the sources and start speaking to the people and look at the issue rather than in the heat of the moment on Rosh Chodesh, on the Jewish New Month, when everybody's getting excited at the Kotel with each other. Study it, think about it, understand where Jewish sources are leading to. One of my Rosh Yeshiva once said to me, you don't necessarily have to say that Judaism has all the answers, but for sure Judaism asks all the questions. So if you have a question and if you have an issue, then for sure there is a detailed and deep, nuanced and sophisticated discussion of that in Jewish sources. And this issue is the case as well. What is the Kotel? Is it a synagogue? It is a place of communal gathering, or what access should people have to it? How do we encourage men and women and Jews and non-Jews all to have access to this very important place at the same time as preserving the dignity of the place, which is not helped by people shouting and screaming at each other, preserving the halachic norms, which I say have always got to be a boundary, and how we understand and interpret those. There are many, many, many different issues here. And of course, this issue is not just about the Kotel. It's about many more fundamental issues, meta issues, such as who in this country should be in charge of running the religious agenda. Should it be in the hands of the rabbinate? Should it be in the hands of the parliament, the Knesset? Should it be in the hands of the people? Which group of Jews should have a hegemony, if you like, over decisions in the Jewish... These are much deeper discussions for which the whole Kotel issue and the Women of the Wall is just a manifestation. They are not the cause. They're just a symptom of what's going on. And again, these are very important issues, and they're great issues. We're very excited to be dealing with these issues. These are not problem issues. These are issues that arise because millions of Jewish people come back to the land of Israel and have to deal with running a country and being in charge to some degree of their own destiny. None of us are in charge of our own destiny. We don't run the world. We know that. But that opportunity to do that is actually very important. So I'd be more of a glass half full type person and say, of course, I'm not happy about the shouting and screaming, but I am happy about the opportunity that this gives us to try and address the issues. And this is one of the things I try and teach. I also give a lecture every Wednesday at the OU Israel Center on contemporary halachic and hashkafic Jewish law and thought issues, which is very well attended. We have about 80, 90 people every week, and we address exactly issues such as that on a Wednesday morning at 10:15. And therefore, I really feel that these issues should be dealt with thoroughly in a more sophisticated, nuanced ways. Let's get away from the news headlines and let's actually think more deeply about things.
So, the way I put it is that we're in charge of the public spaces for the first time in a very long time. It's not just the synagogue and the Jewish home living in different countries or even here in Israel, but under somebody else's rule. Now we have the cup very much half full, which is that we have a Jewish country, and where does Jewish law come in? For example, one of the very big issues is the rabbinate here in Israel and the fact that all divorces and marriages, etc., have to happen, that there really is no separation of church and state. There's no such thing in Israel as having a civil marriage. So as someone also with a background in law, where would you see, if somebody asked you that question, which I am now doing, how would you answer that?
I'm English and you're American. That makes the way we look at the separation of church and state quite different because, as an American, and I teach my American students, this is almost one of the most fundamental principles of political life, that there has to be a separation of church and state. And the truth is, if you analyze that, that is very much a product of the early 18th century and the aftermath of the religious wars of the 17th century, and the Protestant ethic that can be easily split off from the secular state running, etc. And therefore, I understand why that finds its way into the American Constitution and the French Constitution, but it doesn't have to be the way that a country is run. In England, there is no obvious separation of church and state. The Queen is the head of the Church of England as well. But in halacha, and I think this is very important, in Jewish law and in Jewish thought, open every page of the Bible, there is no separation of church and state. And in many ways, that is an artificial separation, because it consigns religion to a dusty corner of a part of your life that maybe you separate and you isolate, and you get up on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning and you do some religious thing, but it doesn't really impact on the rest of your life. That's not the way that Judaism sees life. Judaism sees life as that it involves itself in every iota of life and every day of life and every decision in many ways of life, and that's really an all-encompassing idea. So I don't think it's important that we have a separation of church and state. I think it is important that we all talk to each other in a measured and tolerant way. That's critical. As to whether there should be rabbinic supervision of marriages and life cycle events, that's again a complex issue, because on the one hand, this is a secular democracy in Israel, and people have the right to make choices. On the other hand, we wish and we need to preserve in an important way the nature of this Israel as a Jewish country. It is the only Jewish country in the entire world, and as the way it looks at the moment, is likely to be the only Jewish country in the entire world. There are multiple Christian, Arab, and secular countries and Muslim countries, etc. This is our only country, and therefore we've got to get it right. Maintaining the Jewish nature of a country means that there has to be an authentic connection to Jewish values. There has to be definition of who is Jewish, who isn't Jewish, and they can't just be blurred to the point that everyone decides, as we said before, for themselves. Therefore, it is tricky. People do not like a religious authority involving themselves in their lives, but I think it is unavoidable, and it's necessary that there has to be some level of supervision of that. And do we strike it right, the right balance at the moment? I'm not qualified to say. There are those that have much deeper understandings of these things than I. I think we definitely need to have a strong rabbinic involvement in life cycle events. I think, though, that there's a lot we can do in terms of the interface between the rabbinate and the people, meaning often people are upset about the issue, but it's not always the issue, but it's the way the issue is dealt with and handled. And people's experience sometimes when it comes to government offices, and of course in this country the rabbinate is another one of the government offices, that experience is sometimes stressed and tense and anxiety driven for reasons that can often be avoided. And therefore there are organizations in the country that are not trying to undermine the structures of the rabbinate, which I think would be disastrous for the Jewish nature of the country and completely inappropriate, but rather than undermine them, to make them more user-friendly, to make them more easier to deal with. And I think that's absolutely necessary, because we deal in Israel now in a situation where there is not a deep antagonism between religious and non-religious people. There really isn't. There may have been 100 years ago or 80 years ago when people had more entrenched positions, but there's I sense personally, a much more of an openness by less observant people to connect with Jewish ideas if they're only presented in a way which makes sense to people and is acceptable and interesting to people. And I sense also in the sense of the Jewish religious community, the Orthodox community and the observant community, a much greater openness to try and reach out to other people as well. So I think that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. You'll find any number of people that want to knock down existing structures. People are very good at that. Putting something better in place is a lot harder. You won't find many people helping you build something new, even though they'll help you knock it down. So I don't think we need to be destroying. I think we need to be building and improving on what we have. And there's a lot of work which is being done and which can be done, in my opinion, on that as well.
So, when I look back in the Tanakh, I think that we don't really understand what was happening then, because it was a very different world. You didn't have secular people. You had everybody, I believe, believing in some kind of God or gods. And therefore, that division between your non-religious life and your religious life just simply wasn't there. I mean, if you were a farmer, you knew very well that who was bringing the rain, and it wasn't just happening, and nobody was seeding the clouds. So in that sense, but even there, even in the Bible, you did have some kind of separation between, let's say, the kingship, at least in the first temple period, and the temple. So at least when it came to responsibilities of Jewish life, you had the priests and you had them doing in the temple, those representing what had to be done, versus the king, who the Bible is pretty harsh on and makes very clear that he's making one mistake after the other. I mean, there's no king that comes off as having done everything right. So, in that sense, there is that separation. But I think, especially we're coming up to elections, and a lot of these items have come up. For example, public transportation on Shabbat, which comes up all the time, because right now, if you want to go to the beach on Shabbat, you can get into your private car and do so, but there's no public transportation. And so what's come up over and over in interviews I've had with different people, Rabbi Natan Lopez Cordoza and others, that becomes, then it's an economic issue. And so one of the things that I just read recently has been bandied out is, well, then you can't have a government bus company that's running on Shabbat. Anything that would have to do with the formalities of the state shouldn't. But if somebody wants to open a private initiative and run a private company to take people to the beach, I'm just giving an example, to the beach on Shabbat, that's something that in this country could be allowed. And maybe in here we can kind of find some kind of a middle ground where you're still keeping some kind of framework of Jewish law in the country, at least mandated by the government. But private initiatives are private initiatives. What would you say about that?
So I don't have anything specific to say about exactly where that line should be drawn. And there are people who have worked long and hard on trying to work that compromise out. But I agree 100%. Somewhere between people having complete freedom to do anything they like, wherever they like, whatever they want, which clearly no society on the planet works on that way. The government involves itself in every society, telling us what we can do and what we can't do. Sometimes even when, you would have thought that we should have a choice on the matter, the government does restrict our choices, and that has to be the case everywhere. But on the other hand, you can't have people whose lives are fundamentally locked down by intense overarching government rules.
It's called communism and totalitarian regimes.
Right. And therefore, again, it's trite to say that somewhere between those two things is the right compromise, but that's true. Where that compromise is a good question, but the way we reach it, and this is the point I would stress again, the way we reach it is by educating people on both sides with entrenched views about what they should do and what people should do, educating them as to how the impressions and the conceptions and sometimes misconceptions they have as to what the other side feels are often, very wrong. People have very strong views. Jews, thank God, are very opinionated. They have very strong views about Jewish law, for example, even though those views are not always backed up by a very strong education. And on a certain level, it's wonderful that everybody feels that they should have a strong opinion, but that opinion has to be backed up by understanding and education. And therefore, I feel that, yes, there is a compromise to be made here, but people have to understand what it means, for example, to keep Shabbat. If you're a non-observant person and your only exposure to an understanding of what Shabbat is a news report, which is agenda-driven, as all news reports are, and is designed to try and inflame a certain point of view, that's not helpful. If people are going to understand what Shabbat should be, then everybody has to understand what everybody else means by Shabbat and the beauties of Shabbat and how keeping Shabbat in this country should be a very important part of it being a Jewish country. I remember in England just about 20 years ago when they abolished the laws on Sunday trading that opened up Sunday trading across the board. Look, I'm not a Christian and I didn't celebrate Sundays, but I could see how Sunday was fundamentally changed and in a very negative way by the pressure now on people not only to have to work where they necessarily didn't want to work, but also to go out and shop and do things when they could have done other things. Now, again, enforcing people to spend time with their family is not always the recipe for success in families. but nevertheless, we shouldn't think that just by relaxing the restrictions on what people can do on Saturdays on Shabbat, that will lead to a better result, even for the people who don't keep Shabbat in the way that perhaps the Orthodox world does. There has to be an understanding that again, the Jewish nature of the country, which people appreciate, people who are less observant really appreciate as well. There's something really special about Shabbat in this country. And not just about Shabbat, about Friday in this country. about the day before Shabbat, and you don't feel that even if you go to the most religiously motivated communities in America. You go to Brooklyn, you go to wherever. It's not the same. In this country, there's something very special, and we should not be running headfirst into a decision to do something to that which we will regret later. So, greater minds than I will work out what the compromise is. But understanding and learning and study and education, I think, are really part of the key.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, but you have, I'm just thinking because you are promoting, let's say, learning for women so that they'll at least understand all the different aspects of Judaism. But then you have situations where, for example, learning Gemara and Talmud for some boys is actually turning them off to Judaism. So I hear what you're saying about finding the middle ground. But so much of life in general is emotional. And if somebody has had an amazing teacher, it's going to make all the difference, or an amazing parent, it will make all the difference to their lives. But unfortunately, not everybody does, and maybe even most don't. And so how do we get that in there so that people aren't, their first attitude isn't a negative one? Don't make me do that. Don't make me keep Shabbat. I just read an interesting statistic a few weeks ago. Something like 75% of Israeli families have a Friday night dinner. Now, whether it's a traditional Friday night dinner, meaning, we're all, like, let's say in our homes, we're all, we're off the phones, we're off the computers for 25 hours. It's really just who's in the home that communicates with each other, hopefully, or whether it's just because it's a family night and all the kids are getting out of the army or whatever it is, and everybody just kind of gathering around the table, whatever it is they're doing around the table. There is a sense of Shabbat absolutely as being a very, very special day here. The question is, again, where we frame that and how much we tell people this is what you can and cannot do, because then people get their backs up. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me how to keep Shabbat. It's always better if it comes out of love and out of understanding. But the reality is that very often it doesn't. And I know quite a few young people who grew up in religious homes who left it because they had a negative experience, either with a very overbearing parent, you have to go to synagogue with me on Saturday morning, or a teacher who just said, don't ask questions. It's just that way because it's always been that way. There's no room for any kind of flexibility. And in a world where the young people have information at their fingertips, okay, it's no longer that you only get information from a teacher, from a parent. If you have a cell phone, which almost everybody does, your information is in your hand within 5 seconds. So how do we as parents, how do we as educators and as people who love Judaism to the very core of our being and see this as something much more as just a way of life, but really, at least for me, a way of being, a way of relating to the creator of the world, but also to each other. And I think it is absolutely the most fantastic way of life that we can have. But how do we do that in such a way where there are now options available to keep our kids within that frame?
You've asked about 8 questions there.
I'm sorry, I tend to do that.
It's really fine. Look, there's a number of things. There are a number of things here. First of all, when young people are put off remaining in a life of connection to Jewish observance, that's in many cases, maybe even in the vast majority of cases, not because of the specific issue itself. It's not that people might not want to keep Shabbat or want to not be told to do what to do because of Shabbat. It's because of a much deeper understanding of the relationship they have with their parents, the relationship they have with their teachers, which goes to how we parent and how we teach and how we interact with other people. That's really the much more fundamental point, which itself underpins the importance of interpersonal relationships and what Jewish law and practice and thought has to say. The area of Bein Adam L'Chaveiro is absolutely fundamental to Judaism. 5 of the 10 commandments are dedicated specifically to the way we interact with each other, and therefore I think a re-emphasis, perhaps more than has been in the past, on those areas will help us as children, as parents, as teachers, as students, work out that we shouldn't be raising our defenses all the time on these issues and having to deal with the baggage. You're right, we're emotional people as well. We can't just pretend that just learning the sources is going to deal with all the issues, but learning how to deal with our emotions is also part of a program of Jewish learning and study. And there were entire movements, the Muslim movement in the 19th century in Europe, which was designed to try and help us to deal with and to manage and to get on top of our emotions so that we don't allow them to drive the agenda in a negative way. So that's one thing. So we have to learn to be better parents, which doesn't mean that we have to just let our children do what they want to do or constantly shower them with love and no discipline. There has to be a lot of love, but there have to be lines, and there has to be discipline, and there have to be higher expectations. Sometimes we, I think, in my opinion, dumb down the expectations we have of our children, and they meet that with lower achievement because we expect less from them in some ways. At the same time, we give them a lot of anxiety. I think as parents, a lot of the anxiety I see in my students is being fed down very directly from the anxiety of their parents. But that's a bigger conversation. So we have to work on that. But in terms of how to communicate with people, I'd just say two other things. First of all, something like Shabbat is experiential. You cannot teach people what Shabbat should be. You cannot watch a documentary about Shabbat or read a book about Shabbat and then keep Shabbat. We even see this in the Torah itself. When Moshe is given the commandment by God about Shabbat, when they get the man and in Parshas B'Shalach. So Moshe doesn't communicate to the people everything that God tells him. The people discover for themselves, oh my goodness, we got a double portion. Why did we get a double portion? Why did this happen to us on Friday? And Moshe uses that as an opportunity to say to them, aha, you see, this is called Shabbat. You've experienced something and you've come to me now having experienced it, and that's what Shabbat is. Shabbat is something that people have to enjoy themselves, and therefore one of the ways that we can help people understand Shabbat is by giving them Shabbat experiences, by inviting them to our homes, by opening our institutions and our communities to help people to come and spend Shabbat with us and understand what we do. That's the experiential side, not just Shabbat, but across the board is really important because that kicks in with the emotions. And young people these days very much want an experiential Judaism as well as a thought through intellectual Judaism. And the other point I would make is that the way that we communicate, you're right, they have information, people have information. We're not there to give them information, but we are there to teach people how to process that information, how to weigh up what is valid against what is less valid, what is important against what is less important. I find that my students often have a lot of information, but they don't have any system, if you like, of weighing what is more important and less important within that information and how the information plays again. That we very much need to give them, and that we have to communicate in new ways in each generation. You know, when the vessels for the tabernacle, for the Mishkan were created, they were all created to be, permanent. They weren't recreated in each generation, except for one, which was the trumpets, which Moshe used in order to gather the people to him to teach them. And the rabbis say very specifically, every single new leader had to get rid of the old trumpets and make new trumpets for each generation, because each generation needs a new medium in order to communicate the key ideas of that generation. And therefore, we have to be constantly working out how to readdress education, how to reconnect. Every 3 or 4 years now with young people is a new generation. Maybe it used to be 20, maybe it used to be 10, but now every 3 or 4 years, people are coming with different exposures, with different zeitgeists, the way that they process, the way that they connect, the way that they understand what's right and what's wrong. We have to be on top of that, and we have to realize that people are not coming to us anymore with the same kind of questions that they were not so long ago. I'll just give you an example. 15 years ago, young people were very bothered about issues such as the age of the universe and science and Torah, etc., and they were really, troubled by this. Now, if I give a lecture on those kind of issues, most of them look at me blankly and say, well, I'm not really bothered about the age of the universe, quite frankly. I'm more bothered with how we treat transgender people or how we deal with that in society, and they're very important issues as well, on which the Torah has a lot to say. But you have to move as those issues change. You have to be aware of that even though what we teach, the content of Torah, is very much eternal and goes through the generations without being just reformatted, the way that we teach it and the issues which bother people do change as the generations move forwards.
So do you teach teachers, or by teaching women, you are in a sense teaching teachers, because they may one day be standing from the classroom, but more likely they will be standing in front of their children and moving these ideas forward?
Everybody in Judaism is a teacher. That's why people have a command, V'shinantam levanecha, you must teach to your children. Everybody's a learner, everybody's a teacher. That's why the classic mode of Jewish study is chavruta, is people studying in pairs. Rather than just passively listening to a teacher teaching them, they should be engaged and involved. And in that sense, they are both learning and teaching at the same time. Lilmod ulelamed. Therefore, every time we teach any student, we're teaching teachers to some degree, but we also have to be proactively teaching teachers too. And there are some people who are very good at helping the teachers of our children and students to keep on top of what's going on. We in Midrashet Tehillah recently, we brought in an expert teacher of teachers to teach our own teachers how to improve their own interface with the students, and not being on top of that is really critical. And there are many people that have conferences on that. There's an educational conference that I've spoken at in America that happens in Teaneck in June. Usually I spend the summers lecturing in America. I'm putting that together again this year, and I'm usually there in the fall as well, recruiting. So, I'm very happy to visit communities all over North America and in England as well, and South Africa I go to too. But I spoke recently at a conference which was designed for parents and teachers in how to understand the changing needs of our students and pupils. Therefore, this is something that we're really on top of across the board, across the different range of Jewish communities. I don't think there is anyone now who rests on their laurels and assumes that we can just do everything the way that we used to do. The rabbis say a very interesting idea that, Moses was like the sun and Joshua was like the moon, in the sense that the light that the moon reflects is the light of the sun. It has to be that we reflect the teachings that we've received from the past. The past is key to us and gives us a sense of anchoring and grounding. But when you look at the moon doesn't look like the sun. It looks like the moon, meaning we reflect the light that comes to us from previous generations, but we give off a new, if you like, landscape to the next generation as it's filtered through us, which is really very important too. So this is something that I feel very strongly about. And as I mentioned, when I'm in America, which I'm hoping to be this summer as well, lecturing at different communities, I'm just putting together a lecture speaking tour right now. And when I'm in the UK and South Africa, also maybe going to Australia, these are topics that I really want to address. How we relate to the process of teaching, a process of Jewish law, how we understand that more deeply. And there's so much to say about this. One thing that frustrates me is I think a lot of people, especially in the religious world, are exposed to a very small percentage of what the Torah actually has to say about a lot of different things. The same issues seem to come up a lot. No one should really have to listen to the same Dvar Torah twice. There's so many to choose from, and therefore I feel people are very receptive to this, and I've certainly had a lot of good feedback in places that I've been and spoken to over the years and hope to speak to in the future.
So if someone's listening and wants to either invite you to their community, how do they get in touch with you?
So they can connect with me through my website, www.rabbimanning.com. There's a contact form on that. They can email me directly on rabbi@rabbimanning.com. It's not hard to find me. They can just Google Rabbi Anthony Manning and you'll get a lot of different hits there. You'll be able to find me very easily through that. And as I said, I spend much of the months from October through December in America, recruiting and speaking, and June, July, and August as well. So not just America, but across the world. Very happy to be in touch with people and very happy to come and speak at people's communities.
And are there books, aside from the Tanakh, of course, that you would recommend that people read in the interim where some of the thoughts that you've expressed in the last hour you feel are, cogently represented?
Absolutely. And if you want to go to my website, you will find on the website, rabbimanning.com, a suggested reading list. It's called a post-seminary reading list because it's designed to my women students at seminary, but it's good for men and for women and across the board. There are a list of recommended books and articles categorized and with notes and commentaries as to what they achieve and which order to go about reading them. I'd recommend anybody to go onto that and to have a look at that. That might be helpful, and to give me feedback as to other things that they feel that I should add to that and that will be helpful to people. I'm certainly happy to learn from everybody out there how I can also deepen and make more nuanced my own understanding of Judaism. But that reading list, people have said to me, is helpful, and other people might find it helpful.
Do you ever do interfaith work? Because in every religion there are going to be a lot of the same thing, leaving aside the nuances of the religion and different prophets, et cetera, some of which are very deep, and I'm not, of course, glossing them over in any way. But in terms of this idea of teachers wanting to bring God, which is not such a simple thing, into the world of their children or into their students, is that something that you even have time to do, or you think that's important to do?
Look, I think it's definitely important to do. Unfortunately, we don't have unlimited time. We have to prioritize different areas and different people. I'm always happy to speak to people of all faiths and religions, and it's something that I think more communication is much better than less communication. I feel that there are people with great talents at that. Whether I do or don't is a good question, and they're doing an amazing job. I think it's critically important in interfaith work, by the way, that the people who are speaking are people who represent a mainstream view of the religion that they're representing. Sometimes I wonder whether it's always the acceptable face of that is speaking to the acceptable face of, and people aren't really getting into the real meat and potatoes of it. But that's just a different question. I feel that my personal forte, if I have one, is dealing with young people. I enjoy that. I find that invigorating and certainly energizing. And I'm happy to speak to people of all communities. But I feel that as Jews, we need to educate ourselves first, and then spread that light out to the world. There's no question that Torah is meant to be Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. That Torah is meant to go out to the whole world from Jerusalem, and we're meant to be an or l'goyim, we're meant to be a light to the nations, and everybody is meant to ultimately have something to learn from us, and I really feel very strongly about that. But if we wish to teach others, we have to first know ourselves, and therefore our first obligation, I think, is to teach ourselves and get a more nuanced understanding of our own background and religion, and move that forward to other people as well.
Okay, Rabbi Anthony Manning, thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that my listeners did as well. One of the things that has kept coming up in different shows that I have been doing with people is the kind of education that we're giving our children, let's say the day school education, yeshiva education, is it sustainable also in terms of cost? Because outside of Israel, these kinds of educations can cost a tremendous amount of money, and therefore some people simply can't afford to give their kids a Torah education, at least what you have here in Israel, because it is a Jewish country. So our so-called public school education has Torah in it, and you can find different schools. And that, I think, is something that most people do not appreciate enough of life here in Israel, because education being, how we have brought it all down from year to year. And that's a very, very big thing that the government here, with all that we complain, that we do get that provided for, a real framework for living a Jewish life in so many ways. And so I would hope that when you go out that into the different places around the world, that somehow those communities are able to still to take what you're teaching them, and also on a practical level, because im ein kemach ein Torah, right? If there's no flour, there's no Torah, meaning if there's no economic basis for being able to teach the Torah, it's still not going to happen. Do people come up to you with those questions?
Definitely. The sustainability of the yeshiva high school education is one of the big agenda items, certainly in America and increasingly in other places too. It is tricky because there's an incredible amount of wonderful, wonderful education being done in America in the yeshiva high schools and beyond. But it comes at a cost, and it has to be long-term sustainable as well. I don't think people mind so much paying what they invest in their children's education if they would feel that in the long term that education will lay down deep roots which will carry those children forward to a lifetime of Jewish commitment. Unfortunately, despite the quality of the education, which is undoubtable, that's not always to be taken for granted, because after people leave education, they move into other circles, into university, to college, into the workplace, etc. And keeping those that connection going is equally, if not more important. So I think we have to be working on that too. That's another reason why the year in Israel can be critical for many, many, many people in laying down the roots that they need in order to take that yeshiva high school education, which has been so, amazing and costly, but hopefully worthwhile, and really run with it in life in a way which is long-term sustainable. It's not always easy. We have children, by the way, in post-high school programs from public schools as well in America, and many of them are fantastic students too. So education is a constantly evolving question, and the cost of education, etc. But there's no doubting the quality that we now have across the board in Jewish teachers, in high schools, in elementary schools, in higher education establishments, and the quality of the students as well. The young people in our times are really wonderful people. They're motivated. Many of them are idealistic. They have their own baggage, like we all had our own baggage in our own times. But they give a lot of hope for the future, I think. And if we can combine those two things together and really work hard and not rest on our laurels, but keep on track of what people really need, then I think that there's a lot of positivity in the future.
Okay, that's a wonderful, optimistic note to end this on. Although since it's going to be Purim in just a few days, and since you're the area in which you teach are mainly young women, and of course Purim, the major character in the Purim story, if you will, is Esther. So any kind of message there, somebody said to me years ago that they actually found Esther a tremendously tragic figure, to the point where they don't even think people should be named Esther. And you find a lot of Jewish women are named Esther because she doesn't have Jewish children. All right, she really sacrifices herself for the Jewish people and to save the Jewish people, and then sacrifices her family ultimately, which is maybe, was that worth it? Right, in terms of on a personal level. And when I heard this for the first time, I had like a stab in my heart for Esther herself and what she did. So, what are you telling your girls this week, your young women this week, when it comes to this very interesting holiday where God seems to have hidden his face, where it seems like just coincidental, different events? Really, when you saw it in a bigger picture, you saw Hashem's hand in behind everything that was going on there.
So it's very interesting. The story of Esther and the Megillah is so multifaceted. There are so many different aspects to it. Esther is a tragic figure. One of the key messages I think that young people have to get out of the story of Esther is how they have to step up to the mark and take responsibility. And that was the key. What you have is a rabbinic figure, Mordechai, speaking to a young woman who is a pupil student of his in many ways, Esther, and he says to her, "Look, I don't know why this is happening. I don't even know why you're the queen right now. Maybe," and it's interesting because sometimes, and this personally, on a personal note, irritates me a little bit, rabbis sometimes give the impression that they know how God runs the world, and nobody knows how God runs the world. And even Mordecai, when faced with this apparently obvious reality that she's put there in order to save the Jewish people, doesn't express it as a clear thing, but it says, who knows if this is the moment that you've been put here for? So I think there has to be an element of humility on the rabbinic side and not trying to pretend that we really know everything about everything. But on the other hand, the message to Esther is, if you don't do it, then somebody else will, but then you will lose the opportunity to make that major impact. And therefore, I think people these days need to be given a strong sense of urgency that they need to do it. They need to step up to the plate. They need to be the parents. They need to be the teachers. They need to run the Jewish world. And the Jewish world constantly lurches from moments of crisis to moments of crisis. The part of the Purim story is one of them. But moments of crisis produce moments of opportunity. And that's what really happens in Purim. And also just education, and this is a bigger conversation, but when the rabbis look at the story of Purim, they see it as the end of one era and the beginning of another, the end of a prophetic era where we move from an open hand of God to Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., to an era of rabbinic involvement where we as the people have to really step up and do it ourselves. And that's the whole point. The Second Temple period, which follows on from the Purim story, is a period when the Jewish people themselves became much more enfranchised and involved in learning Torah, in teaching Torah, not just in relying on prophets to tell them what God wants them to do, but to try and really develop their own relationship and responsibility with God. And in many ways, that's the rabbinic message coming out of the Purim story, is that's what it morphs into. And I think that's a very strong message, that we do rely a lot on the people that have given us the Torah in the past, but we need to step up to the responsibility to be the people that create our own relationship with God, with the Jewish people, and teach Torah to the future.
It's a grown-up relationship. It's moving from more of a childhood sense of what the prophets are telling you because they got it directly up on high, to now trying to figure out for ourselves. But I felt for a long time that Judaism is a religion made for grown-ups, that it's a religion of responsibility, of, nobody's dying for our sins or anything else that other religions have. It means all the time reassessing and standing before God and saying, I want to do better, standing in for everybody and saying I want to do better, but really a religion made for grown-ups.
Definitely, and a religion made for people who are given the responsibility of choices. God doesn't come along in Judaism and say, I will save you against your will. It's, I'm there if you want it. It's your choice. Uvacharta b'chaim. You have to choose life. If you don't choose, that's your choice, not to choose this way or that way. And God, if you like, is telling you what will be a healthy choice and encouraging that choice, but at the end of the day, leaving it up to the person as a responsible adult to make that choice themselves. And I agree, that's a very, very important message, that the God wants us to act as grown-ups and to partner, in the creation, recognize with all humility our limitations, and that we do not run the world and not become arrogant, but at the same time, not abstain from the responsibility to do the very best we can.
Which is tough to explain to people, that within the laws, when some people think there's so many laws in Judaism, there's actually at the ultimate core is tremendous free will. So the laws are there in order to enable us to act on our free will, which is very different, I think, than in other ways of life. And for me, really a tremendous joy to be a part of and to be a Jewish mother. And thank you so much again. And our boys, for those who don't know, and most of you probably wouldn't know, were a chavruta in yeshiva during the years, became very, very good friends. Rarely agreed on anything, I think, and I used to overhear their arguments, and they should just both grow into, and your son recently was married, they should just both grow into wonderful husbands and fathers and teachers of Judaism, and reflect on all of us in a way that we have poured so much into them, and hope that they will do.
That's a beautiful bracha. I'd say amen to that. I definitely hope that all of our children and all of the children and families of all of the people who are listening are able to achieve that and to really fulfill their potential and to grow in life and to make a big impact on the world, because, we need every single one out there, and people have their own individual special thing to give.
And with that note, thank you so much, everybody. This is Eve Harrow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. And thank you to Ben and to Tabitha. I will be recording next week back in the United States, heading to APAC after Purim, but would never miss Purim in the land. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week. If it's relevant, have a wonderful, wonderful Purim. And may Hashem continue to surprise us when it looks like things maybe aren't so good. In 1 minute, everything can turn around. And we should just be constantly looking for him in even what looks like the mundane and everyday. So Eve Harrow, take care, everybody. Goodbye for now.
You're listening to the Land